The hall was enormous. It stretched so wide and so tall that the lights near the top looked like distant stars. The walls were made of something smooth and dark, and they curved all the way around, like the inside of a giant shell. There were hundreds of seats arranged, wide rings going up and up like a theater, and every single one of them was filled. 214 species from 214 different worlds, all sitting together in one place. It was called the Galactic Conclave Forum, the greatest meeting hall in the known galaxy, and somewhere near the bottom ring, in the smallest box with the fewest seats and the dimmest light, sat the human delegation. Junho Rai sat at the back of that box. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with short dark hair that had started going gray at the sides. He wore the dark navy uniform of Earth's unified command, with no medals on the chest, no decorations on the collar, just the uniform. He sat with his back straight and his hands flat on the desk, and he watched the room with quiet, steady eyes. In front of him, at the delegation table, sat Minjai Sora. Minjai was not a soldier. She had never held a weapon in her life, but anyone who had ever sat across a negotiating table from her knew that she did not need one. She was in her mid-40s, with sharp eyes and a calm way of speaking that made people listen even when they did not want to. She had been Earth's lead diplomat at the Conclave for 9 years. She knew every rule, every clause, every loophole in the Conclave charter. She had used most of them at least once. Today she was going to need all of them. The session had been called to vote on something called the Outer Belt Expansion Treaty. The name sounded simple. The reality was not. If the treaty passed, human colonies would be legally confined to a narrow band of space, a corridor barely wide enough to sustain Earth's growing population for another century. After that, humanity would simply run out of room. No new worlds, no new systems, just the same shrinking space filling up slowly while every other species in the galaxy expanded freely around them. It had been framed as a matter of galactic safety. The official argument put forward by Ambassador Ti Yang of the Volkai Empire was that human expansion posed a risk to the stability of surrounding sectors. He had said this with the confidence of a man who had never been told no in his life. The Volkai were old. Their civilization had been part of the Conclave for over 4,000 years. Tiang wore robes of deep red and silver, and when he spoke, the room listened the way people listen to someone they have always been told to respect. Minjai had requested the right to respond. She had been granted 4 minutes. She stood and she spoke clearly without notes. She laid out 61 years of data, trade contributions, resource sharing, technological cooperation, humanitarian aid sent to 3 alien worlds during crises that the Conclave itself had been too slow to respond to. She talked about the population, projections about the resource shortfalls that would come if expansion was capped, about the long-term economic damage to humanity's trading partners as well. She was precise, she was thorough, she was by any measure correct. The laughter started about 2 minutes in. It was not all at once. It began somewhere in the upper rings, a sound like wind through strange reeds, and then it spread. Different species laugh in different ways. Some made clicking sounds, some made low rumbles deep in their chests, some simply turned to their neighbors and made gestures that their translators declined to convert. but the meaning was the same across all of them. They were laughing at her. Minjai did not stop. She finished every word of her 4 minutes. Her voice did not shake, her hands did not move from the podium. She looked straight ahead and she said everything she had come to say. And when she was done, she sat down. The room was still buzzing when Taiyang rose again. He was unhurried. He smoothed his robes and looked down at the human delegation. Box the way a person looks at something small they have found on the floor. He said that humanity was a curiosity, a young species, energetic, perhaps even admirable in certain small ways, but fundamentally unpredictable. He said the word dangerous without any apparent concern for how it landed. He said that the treaty was not a punishment, it was simply good management. He said, without lowering his voice, they will be contained because they are simply too dangerous to be trusted with. Mort. The vote was called. 211 species voted in favor of the treaty, 3 voted against it, humanity, and 2 small allied species whose home system sat near the human corridor. Their votes meant nothing. The treaty passed in under 4 minutes. Minjai sat very still when the result was announced. She did not look angry. She did not look sad. She looked like someone who had just confirmed something they had already suspected for a very long time. Junho at the back of the box said nothing. He had not spoken once during the entire session. He had a small notepad on the desk in front of him. He had been writing in it slowly throughout the proceedings. When the vote result came through, he stopped writing. He closed the notepad. He pressed the cover flat with one hand. Then he placed his hands back on the desk. That was all. The session closed with a series of procedural announcements that nobody in the human box listened to. Other delegations began to file out, talking among themselves. Some of them glanced over at the human box as they passed. A few of them looked almost sympathetic. Most of them did not look at all. Minjai gathered her documents slowly. She slid them into a flat case, snapped it shut and stood. She turned to look at Junho. He was already looking at her. She did not say anything, neither did he, but something passed between them. A kind of understanding, quiet and firm, the way understanding passes between 2 people who have been working together long enough to think in the same direction. They walked out together. Behind them, the rest of the delegation followed. The corridor outside the forum was wide and cold. The walls gave off a faint blue light that made everything look slightly unreal. Other species moved through the corridor in groups, their voices mixing into a low, constant hum. No one stopped the humans. No one spoke to them. They were invisible the way small things are invisible in large spaces. Junho walked alongside Minjai without speaking. When they reached the junction that led toward the docking bay, he stopped. Minjai stopped with him. He looked down the corridor toward the forum hall they had just left. He stood there for a moment, very still, the way he used to stand on ship decks before a difficult operation, just long enough to be certain. Then he turned and kept walking. That night aboard the HSV Ironhold, the human diplomatic vessel docked at the outer ring of Helix Sovereign Station. Junho sat alone in the communications room. The room was small and lit by the pale glow of a single screen. Outside the porthole, the neutron star. The station orbited, pulsed with quiet, ancient light. He opened a secure channel to Earth's Unified command, he typed slowly. Choosing each word with care, he did not. Use formal military language, he did not. File a report or a request or a formal grievance. He simply typed a message. Short and clean, and sent it. It read, "Activate protocol sovereign." Silence, we're done talking. He closed the channel. He sat in the dark for a while, then he stood, turned off the screen and went to bed. In the forum hall, 2,000 m away, the vote results were already being filed. Archived and forgotten, the galaxy moved on the way it always did, turning on its own slow axis, indifferent and enormous. It did not yet know what it had started. 3 days passed. The Galactic Conclave Forum continued as it always did. Sessions were called. Votes were cast. Trade agreements were reviewed and signed and filed. 214. Civilizations went about the business of running a galaxy, and humanity sat in its small box at the bottom ring and said nothing. No complaints were filed, no formal objections were raised. The human delegation attended every session, sat in their seats and were quiet. Some of the other delegations noticed, most did. Not. The ones who noticed told themselves it was normal that humans were sulking, that they would come around as they always had before. Because where else did they have to go? On the morning of the 3rd day, the forum was in the middle of a routine trade session. It was the kind of session that put half the room to sleep. A minor shipping dispute between two mid-tier species over tariff classifications in Sector 7. The sort of thing that required 3 hours of deliberation and resulted in a 3-paragraph amendment that nobody would read until the next dispute came along. High Arbiter Selk of the Dravosi Collective was presiding. He was an old being, gray and slow-moving, with 4 narrow eyes that tracked the room with the patient, faintly tired look of someone who had been doing this job for decades. He called speakers in turn. He kept time. He maintained order. It was an ordinary morning. Then Minji Sara walked to the podium. She had not been called. She had not filed a request to speak. She simply stood up, walked down from the human box, crossed the floor of the forum, and stepped up to the central podium. She placed one hand flat on the surface and looked out at the room. The room took a moment to catch up with what it was seeing. Selk leaned forward. Somewhere in the upper rings, voices went quiet, heads turned. Minji did not wait for permission. She began to speak. Her voice was clear and even. She did not rush. She said that the human delegation was invoking Article 9 of the Conclave Charter. She said it simply, the way someone reads an address from a piece of paper, matter of fact, already decided. The room went from quiet to very quiet. Article 9 was the sovereign withdrawal clause. It had been written into the charter at the very beginning, when the conclave was young, as a theoretical option, a safety valve. The idea was that any species could leave the conclave if they chose to, freely and without penalty, because a union only meant something if it was chosen. Nobody had ever used it. Most species had forgotten it existed. The legal scholars of several civilizations had written papers arguing that it was essentially symbolic, a relic of idealistic founding language, that no rational civilization would ever actually invoke. Selk stood up. He said loudly enough for the whole room to hear that this was not the time for this, that this was a trade session. And GT, snorts. And GT, that proper procedure required advance notice and a formal filing period of no less than 30 days. Min Jai looked at him. She said that Article 9 required no filing period. She cited the exact paragraph and line number. She was correct. Everyone in the room who knew the charter well enough confirmed it in the same moment. The way people confirmed something they had hoped was not true. Selk Snort sat down slowly. Min Jai turned back to the room and continued. She spoke for 12 minutes. She did not raise her voice once. She went through 61 years of history in clean, direct language. The first time humanity's proposed expansion had been denied. The first time their trade terms had been revised without consultation. The resource survey data from human systems that had been shared freely with council members and then used against humanity in territorial boundary negotiations. The 3 separate occasions when human vessels had been fired upon near border zones, and the council's response had been a formal note of mild concern. The food aid sent to the Dravosi outer colonies during the collapse of 2341, delivered by human ships funded by human governments, asked for by the Dravosi themselves, and never once acknowledged in any official council record. She named every incident. She gave dates. She gave reference numbers. She did not editorialize. She just told the truth plainly in the order it had happened and let the weight of it sit in the room. Behind her at the entrance to the forum floor, Admiral Junho Rai stood in the open doorway. He had his hands behind his back. He was not facing the room. He was facing outward toward the corridor, his back to the council, still steady, like a door that had already decided to close. Minji reached the end of her address. She said, "We did not come to this galaxy asking for permission to exist. We will not leave asking for it either." Then she stepped back from the podium. The room came apart. It was not one sound. It was dozens of sounds all at once, voices in 17 languages, clicks and tones, and something low and sustained that the translators described only as objection. Selk was on his feet again, his 4 eyes wide, his hands raised. He was saying that this was premature, that the council could reconsider the treaty, that there were processes, that there were proper channels, that no one needed to make a decision today. Other voices joined his. Some of them were urgent, some of them sounded almost afraid. Junho, still facing the corridor, spoke. He did not turn around. He did not raise his voice much, but the room was shaped well for sound, and the room heard him. "We already have," he said. Then he stepped aside. The human delegation came through the door in a single line. They walked the way people walk when they have made up their mind, and there is nothing left to discuss. Not fast, not slow, steady. The sound of their footsteps was the only consistent sound in a room full of noise. They crossed the forum floor, past the central podium, and moved toward the far corridor in a clean, unbroken line. Min Jai fell in at the front of the line. Without looking back, Junho fell in at the rear. Not one of them looked at the room as they left. Wuri Han was 26 years old and 3 months into her first posting as a communications officer aboard the HSV Ironhold. She was watching the live forum feed from the ship's comms bay, a small room that smelled like recycled air and warm electronics. She had been monitoring the trade session out of routine duty, half expecting nothing of note already, thinking about what she was going to eat for lunch. She watched the whole thing without moving. She watched Min Jai step up to the podium. Unannounced, she watched Junho stand with his back to the council. She watched the line of humans cross the floor and disappear through the corridor doorway. The forum camera stayed on the door for a long moment after the last human cleared it. Then the doors closed. The forum fell silent for exactly 4 seconds, 4 full complete seconds of nothing. In a hall built to hold the voices of 214 civilizations, there was no sound at all. Worry sat in her chair in the comms bay and did not breathe. Then the room erupted again and she breathed and she looked at the screen. And she whispered to the empty room around her. They actually did it. Back in the forum, the noise gradually shaped itself back into something functional. Selk called for order. Order came slowly. The trade session was postponed. An emergency closed session was announced for the following day. Ambassador Tiang of the Vorkai Empire sat in his elevated box and watched the doors that the humans had walked through. He had a long, still face and it very little away. He sat for a while after the others around him began moving and talking and filing requests. Then he said quietly to the room that was no longer listening to him, "Good riddance." His aide sitting beside him said nothing, but she had already pulled up a navigational map on her personal screen. It showed the current borders of human controlled space marked in pale blue. She began to highlight one by one the star systems that sat along those borders. She was counting something. Tiang did not ask what. He probably already knew. The first thing humanity did after leaving the conclave was nothing dramatic. They filed paperwork. 61 years of accumulated treaty documents, trade obligations, shared zone agreements, and border protocols all had to be formally closed out. Lawyers on Earth worked in shifts. Offices on 3 different colony worlds stayed lit through their local nights. It was slow, careful, detailed work, and it was done correctly because that was how humans did things when they had decided to do them. By the end of the second week, every obligation was settled, every file was closed, every counterparty had been formally notified. The conclave's legal office sent back automated confirmations because the humans had followed every rule exactly and there was nothing to object to. Then the quiet ended. Daeon Yo had been waiting for this moment for 11 years. He was an engineer, not the kind that appears in stories, not loud or dramatic, just a man who understood how things worked and spent most of his life trying to make them work better. He was 43, thin, with a kind of permanent tiredness in his face that comes from years of doing precise work under conditions that do not reward imprecision. He had been the lead architect of Earth's Cascade Gate program since he was 32. The Cascade Gates were humanity's faster-than-light transit system, network of paired structures that allowed ships to cross vast distances in hours instead of years. The Council had forbidden humanity from building them in the outer sectors, the restricted zones, the treaty corridors, the buffer spaces. All of it off limits. Humanity had complied, and Daeon had spent 11 years drawing plans for gates that could not yet be built, running simulations on construction timelines that had no legal start date, training teams for a deployment that was always waiting for permission that never came. The day after the last treaty file was closed, Dayon sent a single message to his 12 construction teams. It said, "Begin." Within 60 days, 14 Cascade gates went up. The previous Galactic record for a single gate construction was 4 years. That was held by the Vulaki, who had better raw materials, longer experience, and 3 times the workforce. Dayon's teams built each gate in an average of 11 days. They had been rehearsing the process in simulation for so long that the real thing was almost routine. The teams moved with the calm precision of people doing something they had already done 1,000 times in their heads. The gates connected new points across previously restricted sectors. Where there had been empty space, there were now transit corridors where human colony ships had been waiting and holding patterns for years. There were now clear paths forward. The colony ships launched. There were thousands of them. They had been sitting in orbital reserves around Earth and the major colonies for years, fully loaded, fully crewed, waiting for the treaty permission that the Council had made clear would never come. The day the gates opened, they went, not in a trickle, all of them in a wave that stretched across a dozen sectors, simultaneously, each one carrying the people and equipment and intention to build something permanent somewhere new. HFY Beck was on one of those ships. She was a colonial governor, or had been, on a small world in the old treaty corridor. She was practical and direct and not given to speeches. She had run her colony the way a person runs a difficult household with limited resources and the constant awareness that things could go wrong quickly if you stopped paying attention. When our ship came through the new Cascade Gate and she saw the twin planets of the Kepler 7 system on the navigation screen, she stood at the viewport for a long time without speaking. Then she turned to her operations chief and said, "Tell the terraforming teams they're cleared to start on both planets at once." The Council had long classified humanity's terraforming methods as environmentally aggressive. This was technically accurate. Human terraforming was fast. It reshaped geology, seeded atmospheres, redirected water. It was not delicate work, but the Council's concern had always been framed as ecological sensitivity, protecting natural worlds, preserving undisturbed ecosystems. HFY had read the internal council documents once years ago through a source she never named publicly. The ecological concern was not the real concern. The real concern was how fast humans could make a dead rock into a living world. The answer was approximately 6 years for a basic biosphere, 3 if you rushed it. No other species in the conclave came close to that number. The Council had not wanted other civilizations to know what humanity could do when it was left alone to do it. Now there was no council to ask. HFY's teams began on both planets the same week the ships arrived, while the colony ships moved outward and the gates hummed with traffic. The military did its own quiet work. Human warships began patrolling the new border zones. They were not hiding. They were not aggressive. They moved along their patrol routes with the steady, visible presence of ships that belonged exactly where they were, making no threats and requiring none. A Vulkai border scout came through one of the outer sectors about 6 weeks into the expansion. It was a small ship, fast, designed for reconnaissance. It was technically in a zone that had no legal status anymore since the treaties that had defined the old border were closed. The scout hung in the sector for about 8 minutes scanning. Then 3 human dreadnoughts appeared. They had been sitting dark on the far side of a dust field, running cold, waiting. They did not fire, they did not hail on an aggressive frequency. One of them sent a standard short-range message, polite, professional, with the flat tone of someone doing a routine task. It said, "There are no treaties left to file a complaint under. Have a safe journey." The scout left. The dreadnoughts resumed their patrol. Back at Helix Sovereign in the intelligence section of the Conclave's administrative wing, analysts had been filing reports for weeks. The reports were dry and factual and deeply alarming. 14 gates in 60 days, thousands of colony ships in active transit, terraforming operations on multiple worlds running simultaneously, military patrols across sectors that had been empty 3 months ago. One analyst, a young Tethosi named Ravat, had compiled the expansion rate into a projection model. She had checked it 4 times before submitting it, because the numbers looked wrong the first time she ran them. They were not wrong. The model showed that at the current pace, humanity would surpass the Valky Empire in total control space within a decade. Within 25 years, they would be the largest single civilization in the known galaxy. She sent the report up the chain. It came back 2 hours later with a single note from her supervisor: "Recheck your methodology." She rechecked it. The numbers were the same. She sent it again. This time it went directly to Ambassador T. Young. He read it alone in his private chamber, late at night with the door closed. He sat at his desk with the report in front of him and did not move for a long time. His face was still, but his hands were flat on the desk in a way that looked like effort. He had spent 40 years in conclave politics. He had negotiated treaties that shaped the borders of dozens of civilizations. He had never lost a vote that mattered. He had always known what the next move was, and the move after that, and the one after that. He picked up the report and read it again from the beginning. Then he set it down and called for his aide. "Get me the High Arbiter," he said. His voice was even controlled, the voice of a man maintaining composure because the alternative was not acceptable. "What reason should I give?" his aide asked. Tiang looked at the report one more time. "Tell him," he said slowly, "that we need to talk about the humans." He had said those words before, many times over many years. He had always said them from a position of complete confidence, the way you talk about a problem you have already solved. This time it felt different. He did not let that show on his face, but the report stayed open on his desk long after his aide left the room. In the dark and the quiet of his chamber, with the ancient light of the neutron star coming in through the narrow window, Tiang sat alone and looked at the numbers, and for the first time in a very long career he found that he did not know what the next move was. Fear, it turned out, had a very specific shape. It looked like a closed-door meeting that nobody admitted was happening. It sounded like voices kept deliberately low even when the room was sealed. It felt like the moment you check a number a third time and the number is still The same, and you run out of reasons to check it again. That was what the Galactic Council looked like 8 months after the day the humans walked out. High Arbiter Cell called the emergency session on a morning when the regular schedule had nothing important on it. That was deliberate, fewer witnesses, less noise. He marked the session as a routine procedural review, which was the kind of label that made most minor delegates file their attendance forms and then not actually show up. The room that filled was smaller than usual, but the species represented were not small ones. The old powers were there, the ones with the largest fleets and the longest histories. They sat in a tighter cluster than normal, closer to the center, and they spoke with the careful precision of people who had agreed before the meeting to be careful. Selk opened by saying that the situation with humanity was evolving in ways that required discussion. It was the most restrained description of events that anyone in the room had heard in months. The first proper briefing came from the Council's Joint Intelligence Division. An analyst presented the expansion data, the same projections that Tiang had read. Alone in his chamber were now on a large display screen at the front of the room. Impossible to look away from. Colony ships, cascade gates, terraforming operations running on multiple worlds at once, military patrol routes that covered more combined space than the Valkyrie border fleets. Someone asked how long it had taken humanity to reach this level of deployment. 8 months, the analyst said. The room was quiet in the way that rooms get quiet when an answer is worse than people expected. But the deployment numbers were not even the most alarming part of the briefing. The most alarming part came next, delivered in the same flat, factual tone. That made it somehow worse. 8 months ago, the Valkyrie Empire had possessed the most advanced shielding technology in the known galaxy. It had taken them 3 centuries to develop it. The specific alloy composition and energy layering system behind it was considered one of the most closely held technical secrets in Conclave history. 300 years of metallurgical research, 300 years of incremental improvement. The Valky had never shared it. They had never needed to. No one else was close. Humanity had reverse engineered it in 8 months. Not copied it, improved it. The new human shielding system was 17% more efficient at energy dispersion and could be produced at 1/3 of the manufacturing cost using materials available, sectors that the Valky had never thought to look at. One of the Valky delegates at the session said nothing when this was presented. He simply looked at the screen for a long time, then he looked at his hands. Selk moved the briefing along. The second item was about the 3 smaller species who had sent invoice directly to Earth, bypassing the Conclave entirely. The Tethosi, the Marwani, and the Quellan, all of whose border systems sat inside or adjacent to the new human expansion zones. All 3 had signed bilateral agreements with Earth's government. The terms of those agreements were not public, but the Intelligence Division had pieces of them, and the pieces were consistent. Trade access, navigation rights, medical and agricultural support in exchange for peaceful coexistence, fair terms, better than anything the Conclave had ever offered them. 3 species had quietly left the Conclave's orbit without anyone noticing. Until it was done. Selk said they needed to discuss the fleet. The peacekeeping fleet had been assembled quietly over the previous 2 months. It was a collective effort. Ships from 7 major species pooled under a shared command flag. The official reason, if anyone asked, was routine border stabilization. The unofficial reason sat in the room with everyone, and nobody said out loud. It had been positioned near the edge of the new human expansion zone at a distance that was meant to communicate presence without provoking a response. It had not worked the way anyone intended. Jun-Ho had sent a response to Helix Sovereign 14 hours after the fleet reached its position. It had not been addressed to the full council. It had been addressed directly to Selk, which was itself a message, bypassing every formal channel the way you bypass a locked door by going through a window. The message was 8 words long. We have counted your ships. You should count ours. Selk read it aloud to the room because he felt they needed to hear it from him. Rather than from a screen, he read it without expression. Then he waited. Someone asked what humanity's fleet strength currently was. The intelligence analyst pulled up the numbers. The room looked at them. No one spoke for a full minute. The peacekeeping fleet had withdrawn the following morning. No shots, no confrontation. The ship simply turned and went back to where they had come from, quietly and quickly, and no official statement was ever made about why. On Earth, in the chambers of the new Parliament building that had been constructed specifically to house humanity's post-conclave governance structure, Min Jae-sora stood at a wide window and watched the city below. She was now Minister of Interstellar Expansion, which was a title that had not existed a year ago and now carried more weight than almost any other in human government. She had been asked to address Parliament. That afternoon, she had written the speech herself, which was not unusual. What was unusual was how short it was. She had trimmed it down from 12 pages to 3, then from 3 to 1, then from 1 page to 4 lines, which she read without looking at her notes, standing at the podium with the same stillness she always brought to a room. She said, they built a cage around us for 60 years and called it diplomacy. Now they are afraid of what we look like. When we stand up straight, let them look. We are not going to apologize for our height. Parliament was quiet for a moment after she finished. Then it was not quiet at all. Back at Helix Sovereign, the consequences of the session continued to move through the conclave like a slow current. The emergency meeting had not solved anything. It had only made the problem clearer, which sometimes makes things worse. Tiang received the notification on a private channel. The Valky Empire's Internal Council, the body that appointed and dismissed its conclave ambassadors, had placed his position under review. The formal language was diplomatic and vague in the way formal language always is when the real meaning is uncomfortable, but the meaning was plain enough. 40 years of political work, 40 years of knowing the right people and saying the right things and being the loudest voice in the right rooms. And now, because of the reverse-engineered shielding report and the fleet withdrawal and the bilateral agreements and 8 months of data that nobody had predicted, his own people had decided he was no longer an asset. He was removed from his position on a quiet afternoon with no announcement and no ceremony. His access to the forum was quietly downgraded. His aide was reassigned. His office was reallocated. He sat in his private quarters on Helix, sovereign, and looked at the galaxy map. His aide had marked 8 months ago, one with the blue lines of human controlled space. The blue had spread considerably since. Then, he traced the edge of it with one finger, not touching the screen, just hovering. Selk, meanwhile, sat in his own office, with a blank message window open on his screen. He had been sitting with it open for 3 hours. He typed something and deleted it, typed something else and deleted that too. He was trying to find the right words for something he had never done before, which was asking for something from a species he had helped to diminish. In the end, he kept it simple. He wrote, "What would it take to bring humanity back to the table?" He sent it to Junho directly. Junho was in the command room of the HSV Iron Hold when the message came through. He read it once, set it aside, poured himself a cup of coffee from the machine. In the corner, the old battered one that made it too hot and slightly bitter, the one his crew kept suggesting he replace, and that he never did. He drank the coffee. He looked out the porthole at the stars. 3 hours later, he sat back down at the terminal. He typed his reply slowly, thinking between each word. When he was done, he read it back once, then he sent it. It said, "Build us a bigger table." He closed the terminal, picked up his cup, and finished the last cold mouthful. Outside, a new human colony ship passed the Iron Hold on its way through a nearby cascade gate, running smooth and fast, light steady against the dark. He watched it go. The new table was bigger, literally. Someone on the Conclave's construction team had taken the instructions seriously, or perhaps had simply understood it the way it was meant, and the rebuilt Forum Hall at Helix Sovereign had a primary dais that was 40% wider than the original. It could seat 12 delegations instead of 4. The lighting had been adjusted too, warmer and more even, so that no part of the room sat in the dim peripheral glow that had always made the lower boxes feel like an afterthought. The seating rings had been rebuilt in a flatter configuration, less like a theater where someone stood at the bottom to be judged, and more like a circle of equals sharing the same ground. Wari had stood in the docking bay of the HSV Iron Hold and looked at the station through the wide observation window. She had been on the ship for over a year now. She knew every sound it made when it moved, every flicker in the corridor lighting, every small imperfection in the hull that the maintenance crews kept patching, and she kept noticing again. This posting had been 3 months of routine when it started. It had become the most significant year of her life, without her having planned for that at all. She had watched the walk from this ship. She had watched the expansion from this ship, and today she would watch this from this ship, because her duty shift had her at comms, and the live feed from the forum was already running on the secondary screen beside her station. She did not mind watching from here. She had a good view. The human delegation arrived at Helix Sovereign on a cold docking morning, which was the only kind of morning space station had. 4 ships came in formation. The Iron Hold led them behind. It came 3 newer vessels, larger and quieter, built in the yards that had opened during the expansion year. They docked in the berths that Selk's office had specifically reserved, which were large and centrally located, and not for the first time at the outer ring. Mindesora walked off the ship first. She wore a jacket of deep blue, fitted and clean lined with no insignia. No medals, no decorations. She had chosen it specifically because it was not a uniform and not a diplomatic robe. It was just something a person wore when they were confident enough in where they were going that they did not need to announce it with what they had on. Behind her came the delegation, 19 people, more than humanity had ever sent to a session before. Behind them came Jono, who walked at the back of the group the way he always did, unhurried, with his hands loose at his sides and his eyes on the corridor ahead. He had worn his uniform, full dress, not because he wanted to make a point about the military, because snorts he had earned it, and because today was the kind of day that asked you to be completely, clearly, undisguisedly what you were. The forum filled slowly. Delegations arrived from 209 civilizations. 5 species had declined to attend for their own reasons. Their absence was noted and then set aside. 209 was more than the original conclave had ever held at a single session, and there was something in the air of the rebuilt hall that felt different from any session Mindy had ever attended before. Not tense exactly, more like the feeling in a room before something that has been delayed for a long time finally begins. High Arbiter Selk took his place at the presiding position. He looked older than he had a year ago, which was possible, and also like a man who had spent considerable time thinking, which was definitely true. He opened the session with less formality than usual. He said that the conclave was here to sign a new charter. He said it plainly, without the layers of procedural language that normally buried the actual point of a session. Under 12 minutes of preamble, he said it. And then he sat down. The new Galactic Conclave Charter had been drafted over 4 months. Earth's diplomatic corps had written the first version and circulated it. It had come back with suggested changes from 67 species, most of which were reasonable, and some of which were attempts to quietly reinsert old language about expansion limits and tiered voting, which were rejected. The final document had been agreed to by every species attending. It abolished tiered voting. Every registered civilization had 1 vote. No species could hold more than 1 seat on the governing panel at a time. Expansion into uninhabited systems required only a standard survey. Notification, not a full council. Approval vote. Border disputes were to be handled through a new mediation body with equal representation across species sizes. The language about containment zones and buffer corridors was gone completely. Daeon Yo sat in the delegation and watched the charter display screen with the quiet satisfaction of someone seeing a long project reach its conclusion. He had brought, as a gesture from Earth's Science Ministry, a full technical package of Cascade Gate specifications. Open access, free to any conclave member who wanted to build their own. He would hand it over after the signing. It was not charity, it was partnership. The difference mattered, and he had made sure the language in the accompanying letter said so clearly. Hyrie Back sat 2 seats down from Daeon. She had come from Kepler 7, where the first biosphere was already stabilizing and the second was 6 months behind it. She had left her operations chief in charge for the week, which she had done with the particular mixture of trust and anxiety that defines handing off something you care about deeply. She was not much for ceremonial events, but when Selk had asked her to attend as a colonial representative, as proof of what human settlement looked like when built freely and fairly. She had agreed without hesitation. Because it was proof, she had built it herself, and she knew what it was. Riva, the young Tethosi analyst who had written the expansion projection report, was attending as a junior member of the Tethosi delegation. She had not expected to be there. Clear's throat. She had been told 3 days before the session that her delegation's senior envoy had specifically requested her presence. She had asked why. The envoy had said simply that the person most familiar with the data should be in the room when the data became history. She sat in her seat and looked at the forum around her, at the new lighting and the wider dais and the even rings of seats, and thought about the report she had filed 10 months ago that her supervisor had told her to recheck. She had rechecked it. The numbers had been right. Minji took the podium. She looked out at the room for a moment before speaking, the way a person looks at something they have been walking toward for a long time and finally reached. She looked at the 209 delegations. She looked at the new table wide enough to hold them all. She looked at Jun-ho standing at the edge of the delegation area, straight and still, watching the room with the quiet attention of someone who had already decided what he thought and was now simply observing the outcome. She spoke. "We are not returning because we need you," she said. "We are returning because a united galaxy is better than a fearful one. But let there be no confusion about what changed and what did not. We changed nothing. You finally saw us clearly." She stepped back from the podium. The charter was brought to the primary dais and placed on a wide, flat surface. Selk signed it first, slowly and formally. Then the delegations came forward in turn, in alphabetical order, by species name, and they signed it one by one. It took a long time. Nobody left. Nobody talked over the process the way they usually did during long procedural sessions. The room was patient in a way it had rarely been. When the last signature was placed, Selk closed the document and looked up at the room. "The new Galactic conclave is in session," he said. Nobody laughed. After the formal proceedings, during the reception period, Riveth found herself standing near Admiral Jun-ho, who was holding a small cup of something warm that someone had handed him and which he appeared to be drinking out of politeness rather than preference. She had not planned to speak to him, but she was close and he noticed her, and the look on his face was approachable enough that she asked before she could think better of it. She said, "What was humanity's goal all along? I mean, what were you actually trying to accomplish?" Jun-ho looked at her. He considered the question with the same thoroughness he appeared to give everything. Then he said, "To be treated like what we are. Nothing more." She said, "And what are you?" He stood up a little straighter, not taller exactly, just more fully present, the way a person stands when they stop holding anything back. He looked out at the forum around them, at 209 civilizations who had, a year ago, laughed at a human diplomat and voted to confine her people to a corridor of space, and who now sat in a hall rebuilt to their specification under a charter written in their hand in a conclave that would not have reformed without them. "Exactly what you see," he said. Worry hand closed the forum feed on the secondary screen and returned her attention to her console. There were patrol logs to file, a navigation update from the Kepler 7 corridor, Maintenance request from Deck 3. Ordinary things, the kind of things that filled an ordinary shift on an ordinary day. She began with the patrol logs. Outside through the porthole of the HSV. Iron Hold Helix Sovereign Station turned slowly against the light of the distant neutron star, old and vast and permanent, the way things are when they have learned to change before they break. A new colony ship passed, running fast and steady toward a gate. Just another day.